G'day mate, 40 here. So have you read that last of Tom Wolfe's novels, Back to Blood? It's set in Miami, it's about immigration, and one of the main characters is a news reporter for Miami Herald, John Smith. And Tom Wolfe writes about the type of people who become news reporters. He says news reporters are created at age 6 when they first go to school, and this rings true to me. In the schoolyard, boys immediately divide into two types. Immediately, there are those who have the will to be daring and dominate, and those who don't have it. Those who don't, like the journalist John Smith here, spend half their early years trying to work out a modus vivendi with those who do, and anything short of subservience will be okay. But there are boys from the weaker side of the divide who grow up with the same dreams as the stronger. And the boy standing before me, John Smith, is one of them. These weak boys, too, dream of power, money, fame, and beautiful lovers. So boys like this grow up instinctively realizing that language is a sword or a gun. So I remember in second grade, that's when I entered school, second grade, I wrote a poem, and suddenly people around me were affected by it. It's like, whoa, I can write things that affect people. And I realized skillfully that language has the power to achieve things. Well, maybe not so much to achieve things as to tear things down, including people, including the boys who come out on the strong side of the dividing line. That's what liberals are. Ideology, economics, social justice, those are nothing but their prom outfits. Their politics were set for life in the schoolyard at age 6. They were the weak, and forever after, they resented the strong. That's why so many journalists are liberals. And then Noah Smith confirms this view. He's an economics columnist for Bloomberg, and he tweets, "Getting picked on by rednecks as a kid sucked." Yeah, I got picked on a little bit at school, but I didn't enter public school till 10th grade, so there wasn't so much bullying in the private schools I went to. So what did liberal Gen Xers and millennials do? We moved out. We didn't stay and work to build a real nation out of the people who gave us a hard time. We got college degrees that allowed us to escape to better places. So a little overview of the type of people who become journalists. And then interesting op-ed in The Guardian today. It's an excerpt from a new book that's called The Art of Thinking Clearly, Better Thinking, Better Decisions by Rolf Dobelli. And he says news is bad for you and giving up reading it will make you happier. So you've heard of the term evolutionary mismatch. So we did not evolve in circumstances where there are supermarkets around. Like we evolved where food was scarce, and so that when you could get food, you ate food. Now we live with an abundance of food, and so our evolutionary tendencies to see food, eat food, consume food, stuff food down because we never know where food will come next, and to consume food with carbohydrates and things that excite our taste buds, just eat as much as we want. Obviously, that's not so good for us now. But the news told me that everyone should get vaxxed or they're bad people. Isn't that good for me? Interesting. Maybe. I do think that pretty much everyone should get vaccinated. And that's my thought, but I don't really know enough to get all self-righteous about it. So this essay says news is bad for your health. So maybe it's an evolutionary mismatch, like the vast abundance of cheap carbs and junk food, and how it just excites our taste buds, but it's really bad for us. So, and then maybe like the serotonin hits that we get when we check Twitter or social media, maybe that's bad for us too, or picking up our phone. So I think I pick up my phone about 40 times a day. Based, I respect the acknowledgement of relative ignorance. So news is bad for your health. It leads to fear and aggression and hinders your creativity and your ability to think deeply. The solution, stop consuming it altogether. So I admit that some of the time I think, what the hell am I doing here? I'm I'm not saying anything that people can't get elsewhere. I'm wasting my time. And then I got a comment on just a throwaway video I think I made on Friday. I think I just made a 5-minute video, less than 5 minutes, on the advantages of just trying to understand how the world works versus being in a state of judgment. And there are absolutely times of being in a state of judgment. It is inescapable. We can't help judging, right? That is inherent to who we are as human beings. But it's all about the percentages. Right? Do you walk around outraged and judging 90% of the time? Or do you walk around outraged and judging, maybe 5% of the time? So I think I've shifted over the past year or two or three into spending more time just trying to understand how the world works, trying to understand how power works, understand why people act the way they do, why people think the way they do, rather than trying to be an activist. Negative self-talk about what you're not good enough is the root of paralysis and demotivation. Well, I did an earlier video about the benefits of depression, and I don't think I'm depressed, but I just realized I was expending a lot of energy in a way that wasn't productive on my 3-hour daily live streams. And so I took a step back, and I'm no longer making that expenditure, and I'm doing many fewer streams, briefer streams, and just thinking about what will be my path ahead. So recognizing what's not working, I think, is valuable, and also recognizing what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and coming to terms with endeavors that are not productive, and taking a pause from endeavors that are not productive to maybe direct yourself in a more productive way, I think is useful. So I got a comment yesterday that really moved me from the Reasonable and Responsible guy. So he's a Haredi Jew on the East Coast. And he said about my understanding versus judgment stream, "You have influenced my thinking and behavior toward more trying to understand and accept reality as it is, more trying to learn and to understand others' thinking and perspective, and less lecturing, less preaching, less presuming to judge, merely seeking to have my views and biases confirmed and corroborated. It is a constant challenge." Wow. So I did this 4-minute stream on understanding versus judgment, and one person seems to have been positively affected by this stream of my thinking. And Partybot says, "We missed the full Monty 40 University stream. Perhaps a weekly traditional show could keep the community and fan base engaged. We sit in anticipation, good sir, eagerly awaiting the supreme analysis of our moral leader." So I'm sure I'll do some longer streams in the future. I just don't have to rush into it right now. No one streams Tucker Carlson monologues better than Luke Ford. So this is negative self-talk about why you're not good enough is the root of paralysis and demotivation. That's interesting. So I think what you're referring to here is this underlying feeling of lack of self-worth, but recognizing your limitations and what you're not good at, and recognizing what you are good at, I think is wisdom. But say the feeling that you're unworthy to share your views on YouTube, or thinking that you're unworthy of having a larger life or a more prosperous life, or that you're not worthy of going out and being social and making friends. Yeah, I think obviously that's the root of paralysis and demotivation. But I think there's really adaptive time for paralysis and demotivation. I think there are times when we should stop exerting ourselves, stop pursuing things, and just be paralyzed and just think. And just let go of motivation, get into paralysis, and just think about the new ways that you want to exert yourself, and think through what would be the implications if I exert myself in this way. Would this negatively affect other areas of my life? So yeah, I think there's a time for sadness, there's a time for introspection, and there's a time for not taking action. I think a young person is better served by irrational exuberance than awareness of their limitations. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. So I'm not sure. I think I'm 50-50 on that. Certainly don't do anything that could have serious long-term negative consequences for you, like jumping off a bridge from a great height. So news is bad for your health, says The Guardian. It leads to fear and aggression. It hinders your creativity and your ability to think deeply. The solution, stop consuming it altogether. And Ironwood says, incoming hurricane will not hit me because I do not watch the news. So this is an essay in The Guardian. So good on The Guardian for publishing this. The past few decades, the fortunate among us have recognized this hazards of living with an overabundance of food, obesity, diabetes. We have started to change our diets. Yeah, this is a product of evolutionary mismatch. But most of us do not yet understand that news is to the mind what sugar is to the body. So yeah, I'm struck by the number of smart people who tell me they can no longer concentrate on reading a book because their mind has been programmed from social media to just get things in bite-sized doses. And because I continue to enjoy reading books, this isn't my experience, but I'm surprised how many people tell me they can no longer read books. The news is easy to digest. I remember in my journalistic training, we were taught to present the news as if to an 8th grader, to a typical 8th grader. That's kind of the level that you're aiming at. So the news media feeds us small bites of trivial matter, true. Tidbits that don't really concern our lives and don't require thinking, generally true. And Ricardo says, I can't wait for the paragraph where right-wing news is more harmful than normal news. Well, you can know that there is no such paragraph in this essay. So the media feeds us small bites of trivial matter, tidbits that don't concern our lives and don't require thinking. That's why we experience no saturation. That's a good point. So you can eat carbs and not be full. But if you eat a steak, you'll feel full. If you eat meat, you'll feel full. If you eat food that's heavy in fat and protein, generally speaking, you'll feel full. So I think news, generally speaking, is like cheap carbs. And a book is like eating a steak. So unlike reading books and long magazine articles, which require thinking, we can swallow limitless quantities of news flashes, which are bright colored candies for the mind. I think there's something to that. Today we have reached the same point in relation to information that we faced 20 years ago in regard to food. We are beginning to recognize how toxic news can be. If you eat properly cooked lentils, you will not be full. So I grew up on lentils. I think I can get full on lentils, but I do think being vegetarian sucks. I regret that I'm a vegetarian. I'm a self-hating vegetarian. News misleads. And so this is an example borrowed from Nicholas Nassim Taleb. A car drives over a bridge and the bridge collapses. But what does the news focus on? It focuses on the car and the person in the car, where he came from, where he planned to go, how he experienced the crash, if he survived. But that's not particularly important. What's relevant is the structural stability of the bridge. Right? That's the underlying risk that has been lurking there and in other bridges. But the car falling off the bridge, that is flashy, that is dramatic. It's a person, so it's not abstract, and it's news, it's cheap to produce. So news leads us to walk around with this completely wrong risk map in our heads. Terrorism is overrated as a threat to your life. Chronic stress is probably underrated. The collapse of Lehman Brothers is overrated. Fiscal irresponsibility is underrated. Astronauts are overrated. Nurses are underrated. So we're not rational enough to be exposed to the news. Watching an airplane crash on TV is going to change your attitude toward that risk, regardless of its real probability. If you think you can compensate with the strength of your own inner contemplation, you are wrong. Bankers and economists who have powerful incentives to compensate for news hazards have shown that they cannot. So the only solution, cut yourself off from news consumption entirely. Wow. So every day I start off with the Drudge Report and then go to the LA Times, then the New York Times, then the Washington Post, then Steve Saylor, then the Wall Street Journal. And I also read the website Outside the Beltway several times a week. News is irrelevant. Out of the approximately 10,000 news stories you have read in the last 12 months, name one that allowed you to make a better decision about a serious matter affecting your life, your career, or your business. I think this is overstated. I think I frequently find insightful articles that enable me to make better decisions. Yeah, I need to learn to eat meat. That's a failing. The consumption of news is irrelevant to your life, but people find it difficult to recognize what's relevant. It's much easier to recognize what's new. The relevant versus the new is the fundamental battle of our current age. Media organizations want you to believe that news offers you some sort of competitive advantage. That's true. They do programs like get informed so you can make better decisions. Many people fall for that. We're anxious when we're cut off from the news. In reality, news consumption places us at a complete competitive disadvantage. The less news you consume, the bigger advantage you have. I think there's a dramatic difference between watching news on TV or just getting news on Facebook or Twitter versus reading lengthy articles. So if more information leads to higher economic success, we would expect journalists to be at the top of the pyramid. I think there's a fallacy there. So just because journalists are producing news and news creates some sort of advantage, it doesn't mean that the people who create the advantage are going to be at the top of the pyramid. News is toxic to your body. It constantly triggers the limbic system. So panicky stories spur the release of cortisol, that's the stress hormone. This deregulates your immune system and inhibits the release of growth hormones. So your body finds itself in a state of chronic stress when you follow the news. So high cortisol levels cause impaired digestion, lack of growth, cell, hair, bone, nervousness, and susceptibility to infection. And other side effects include fear, aggression, tunnel vision, and desensitization. News increases cognitive errors. So news feeds the mother of all cognitive errors, confirmation bias. So what the human being does best, says Warren Buffett, is interpreting all new information so that their prior conclusion remains intact. I just heard, don't know if it's true, but 80% of reality we either distort or ignore so that we can continue feeling safe. So news exacerbates our tendency towards confirmation bias. We become prone to overconfidence, we take stupid risks, we misjudge opportunities. Our brains crave stories that make sense, even if they don't correspond to reality. Any story that makes sense is one that corresponds to our worldview. So any journalist who writes the market moved because of X is an idiot. I'm fed up with this cheap way of explaining the world. Live stream your return to meat consumption, Luke. Huge ratings. More gesticulation, please. Animated forward is best forward. Watching COVID news puts you more at risk for COVID by stressing you out and compromising your immune system. With the news, you lose. When did you start thinking you should eat meat? Reading Nathan Kaufman's. He wrote a deconstruction of analyses that say vegetarianism is perfectly healthy. He made the point that everyone studying these matters about vegetarianism, they usually have a bias towards vegetarianism. And so he pointed out the cognitive and health problems with being vegetarian. So I read that from Kaufman's shortly after I read his critique of Kevin McDonald's work. So that started me thinking, hey, being vegetarian is not so healthy. So for years, people told me you should eat meat. Like, that's why you got chronic fatigue syndrome. And I just ignored them. And now, now I'm realizing that they're right. News inhibits thinking. Thinking requires concentration. Concentration requires uninterrupted time. News is designed to interrupt you. News stories are like viruses that steal attention for their own purposes. News makes us shallow thinkers. News severely affects the memory. So there are two types of memory: long-term memory, and our capacity for that is nearly infinite. Working memory is limited to a certain amount of slippery data. The path from short-term to long-term memory is a choke point in the brain. Anything you want to understand must pass through that choke point. If this passageway is disrupted, nothing gets through. Because news disrupts concentration, it weakens comprehension. Online news has an even worse impact, and comprehension declines as the number of hyperlinks in a story increases, because whenever a hyperlink appears, your brain has to make the choice not to click, which is in itself distracting. So news is an intentional interruption system. News works like a drug. I know this. If I start watching a little bit of a game, it becomes really important to me to know how the game turns out. So as news stories develop, we want to know how they continue. We've got hundreds of arbitrary stories in our head, so this craving becomes increasingly compelling and hard to ignore. Yeah, if I start watching a game, I have to know how it turned out, and it's hard to stop watching it. So the more news we consume, the more we exercise the neural circuits in our brain devoted to skimming and to multitasking, while we ignore those neural circuits used for reading deeply, thinking deeply with profound focus. So most news consumers, even if they used to be avid book readers, have lost the ability to absorb lengthy articles or books. After 4 or 5 pages, they get tired, their concentration vanishes, they become restless. It's not because they're old, because their schedules have become more demanding. It's because the physical structure of their brains has changed. Everything we do affects the structure of our brains. So neurons that wire together fire together. News wastes time. So if you spend, say, an hour a day watching the news, that's half a day a week wasted. News makes us passive. News stories are overwhelmingly about things that we cannot influence. The daily repetition about things we can't act upon makes us passive. It grinds us down until we accept a worldview that is pessimistic, desensitized, sarcastic, and fatalistic. The scientific term is learned helplessness. So maybe news consumption has contributed to depression, and news kills creativity. Right? People tend to produce the most creative works at a young age, when their brains enjoy a wide, uninhabited space that emboldens them to come up with novel ideas. I don't know a single truly creative mind who is a news junkie. Not a writer, not a composer, not a mathematician, a doctor, a scientist, musician, designer, architect, or painter. But I do know a bunch of viciously uncreative minds who consume news like drugs. If you want to come up with old solutions, read the news. If you're looking for new solutions, don't. Bye-bye.